Hello and welcome to another Facebook Live session. This video will be available for watching afterwards, but will be recorded during a live session, so there may be interruptions and people talking all the way through the chat. If you have any comments or want to contribute to this video, then feel free to go along afterwards and enter some comments onto Facebook, and we can enter into discussion later. Excuse me. So I usually try and waffle on for a little bit before I get the video started, but I'm just going to go ahead and start talking, and as people join I might randomly say hello. It's not to you, it's for people joining because it is recorded as a live session. So let me just start. This Facebook Live is about trauma, and particularly about how the brain processes trauma and how it affects your behavior in day-to-day life. And so let me just start off by talking about trauma a wee bit. So I am currently a member of an ACEs forum. Now ACEs is Adverse Childhood Experiences. And there has been a lot of studies recently about the effect of our adverse childhood experiences on our adult life, on our physical well-being, not just our mental well-being. And a couple of doctors in the US discovered when they were working with cardiology patients and various other patients that a lot of their symptoms were more explained by their childhood experiences than they were by their day-to-day lifestyle. And so they looked into it more, and they started doing a survey which they call ACEs, which is how many adverse childhood experiences do you have? And based on how many you have, they can predict sorts of health issues that you might experience going forward. And they have this idea of toxic stress, which is worse than just regular stress. It's the kind of coping stress that we get as a result of the things that happen to us. And so there's lots of great stuff going on about how you help people get over their childhood traumas, whatever they happen to be, and lots of work about how we can work with schools and the language we can use and things like that. So there's lots of stuff going on, and there's lots of talk about trauma. And it struck me that we do talk about trauma an awful lot, and everybody has a different definition of trauma. And it's very easy to get into a rut of a definition of trauma almost. So let me just give you my perspective from working with clients, from personal experience of what trauma tends to be. So trauma does not tend to be what everybody might regard it as. So somebody seeing an arm blown off, being in a bomb, being in a situation where they see somebody die, those can be traumatic, obviously. But everybody deals with those differently. And there are a whole bunch of other things that are really difficult to deal with that can actually tip over into a traumatic experience, depending on how you process it. And that is the key thing with trauma. If you talk to anybody who talks about trauma, what they tend to do is, if you've experienced a traumatic event, none of the professional organizations will see you for about 3 to 6 months afterwards, because they need to know how your brain is processing it. And I think that's the first key point that I want to call out here. Trauma is personal. What we each experience as a traumatic event is unique to us. So if 10 people experience the same event, they will not all experience it as traumatic. Whereas if you were to write it down on a piece of paper and get loads of people to read it, they go, oh, that sounds like a really traumatic event. So that's the first thing that's really important to remember, is that we each experience things in our own unique way, based on our own perspective, our own personal experiences, and our own interpretation of an individual event. So you can't decide on somebody else's behalf that they have been traumatized. You can, from their signals and behaviors, have a guess that they might have been traumatized, even if they don't recognize it. So step one, trauma is individual and unique and personal. Step two, what causes us to experience something as trauma? If it is so personal, why is it traumatic to some people and not to others? So the interesting thing about trauma is it is where the brain finds something so difficult to deal with so difficult to comprehend or emotionally take on board that the only way to deal with it is to not deal with it. That's what trauma in the brain is. Something where you find it so hard to process, so hard to look it right in the eye, that the only option you have is to shut it away in some way, shape, or form. That, in my experience of working with clients, and as I say, my own personal experience, is what causes traumatic moments. So very often, it's not what somebody would write down on a piece of paper. You can have horrendous things happen, and you might look at that and go, that was awful, that must have been really traumatic, but it's not. Unless that person has a difficulty coping with it, in which case the brain interprets it as traumatic and shuts down. Hopefully that makes some kind of sense. So let me give you a really simple example that wasn't traumatic at all, but is a really good example of how this works. So many, many years ago, my husband used to be in the police, and he was investigating people in the police, and there was a guy who'd basically flashed to a couple of teenage girls. So the girls have been walking down the street, the guy goes, way, and my husband goes to interview both of the girls once they were at home. And the first girl he interviews, the mother's there with the girl going, what a stupid man, you know, wasn't that ridiculous? Just kind of making a joke out of it. And the girl and the mother were kind of having a bit of banter about it and how ridiculous this guy was. And it was just, you know, they were taking a statement, but they were having a bit of banter. He then goes to the second house, and the second house, the mother is like, oh, this is so awful for her. How did this girl, poor girl, be exposed to such, you know, this is going to cause her such problems in later life that she's had to see this thing. Now, the same incident had happened for both of these people. But for one of them, they had been given a mechanism to deal with it, to make it ridiculous, to make it silly. But for the other one, it had been made more by that environment and by that conversation, which would have made their brain store it in that really traumatic way. So the way we deal with trauma defines whether it's trauma or not. The way we deal with things defines whether it's trauma or not. Now, you might notice in the context of that conversation, it's really important to use the right language. By the way, this little circle over my head is a light. You know, it's really hard to do that in mirror. So you know, if you think I've got a halo or a very small halo, it's not really. The context of the way we tell our story, or the way we have help telling our story, makes a massive difference to the way our brain stores it. And this is really relevant if you work in an environment where you're dealing with people who are experiencing intense emotional events that could be difficult to deal with, because you've got to recognize that your language can actually help or hinder the encoding of that moment in their brain. If you say that must have been really traumatic for you, then the brain's going to go, oh, traumatic, yeah. And it's not like you're suggesting it or you're making it traumatic. It's just in that first few months after something like that, your brain has to decide how it fits in with the whole picture. So it doesn't mean that you can't have events that absolutely suck, that are absolutely awful, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're traumatic events. Traumatic events are something different. Traumatic events are where your brain shuts down. So step one is we all experience trauma personally. Step two is trauma is the way we interpret things and the way it's encoded in our brain, and that can change both over time and with external input. So we have to be very careful of our language around trauma, and we have to be very careful when we interpret something as traumatic that may well not be at all. And that example gives you a kind of simple way of seeing how it can be such extremes. So then what? So let's assume that somebody has experienced something traumatic. Now, there is a range of traumatic things that can happen. Obviously, abusive childhood things can be traumatic. But you know what? Very often the things that are in an abusive childhood that are traumatic are not what you think. So in a violent household, with a father who beats a kid all the time, every time he beats the kid, it's not traumatic. But there could be one tipping point where he, tore the head off a doll, and it was a much loved toy, or he threw the doll in the garden or something like that, you know? So that person could have been beaten black and blue, but having their doll thrown in the garden could have been so incomprehensible because they could have reconciled being beaten. They could have said that was my fault. And then they could, but you know, how do I understand that he threw something I loved away? So you can see how those traumatic moments can be so different and not what you might expect. So the traumatic moments are where you try and understand something and you can't, where you try and relate it to what it means about you and you can't, where it's too difficult or too emotionally painful or too scary or too whatever. There is a tipping point in a trauma. And the tipping point is usually 10 to 20 seconds. Of all the bad things that happen, of all the moments of the bad things that happen, that tipping point that turns it into a traumatic memory, 10, 20 seconds maximum. Those seconds become locked away, flashbacks, whatever you want to call them. But they have a material and fundamental difference on the rest of your brain for the rest of your life, which is why it's a bit challenging if somebody experiences trauma quite early, because experiencing trauma quite early can mean that the rest of their life is after trauma. And that is a different space in the brain. So the next thing that happens is, okay, so what actually happens in the brain when we experience trauma? And you will read lots of stuff about the amygdala and the programming and stuff like that. And you've heard me talk before about how the brain is plastic. The brain is rewiring itself all the time. This is neuroplasticity. Everything we do rewires the brain. So if I say, don't think of a pink elephant, ta-da, you're thinking of a pink elephant. And now it's going to be really hard not to think of a pink elephant, not just because I'm saying it, but because you've got a pink elephant in mind. And you might try and think of a different thing, like a blue elephant, but it's still not going to help you not think of something because you can't not think of something. So your brain is constantly programming and updating and rewiring. And you know the thing that's really interesting? No revision history. Your brain does not have a revision history. There's no track changes. There's no record of what was. There's only a record of what is. And everything is as is. So what happens when you experience trauma? What happens when you reach that tipping point where you can't process stuff? The shutters come down. You fall down a black hole, a brick wall goes up. You think of whatever metaphor you want. But what happens is we've got this nice little structure in our brain. It's a stupid structure, granted, because it's based on a very primitive set of caveman rules, but it's his structure. It tells you this is scary, don't jump off a big building, don't stick your hand in a fire, you know, don't talk to strangers, whatever it happens to be. You've got structure. And that structure can be used and followed as you go through stuff. And when the tipping point happens and the shutters come down, then what happens is that structure is cut off. Do you know what's really weird? I'm kind of doing it this way and it's going a different way on the camera. It's like this mirror effect. It's really distracting. If I try and... Nope, see, that was the wrong side. Anyway. So what happens is you reach this tipping point, the shutters have come down and you lose access to the structure. And losing access to the structure is a problem because the structure at least tells you what is and isn't safe. So everything after this coming down, everything after this point becomes unsafe. And that's a big problem. That's the biggest problem with experiencing trauma, is it puts you in a state of hypervigilance where everything becomes unsafe. And you can do work and it can change how you feel right now, but it doesn't tend to stick because you're not changing this set of rules that was kind of cut off. And so that's the biggest problem with trauma, is you can't talk people out of that state because they're not really thinking, because they haven't got anything to hold on to. So you end up with emotions that are non-existent because emotions are unsafe, or you end up with out of control emotions because there's no regulation for them, there's no structure on what should and shouldn't be emotional. You end up in a kind of not you state of just surviving. And that's the worst thing about trauma, is the shutters coming down. Not what happened. Because, as I say, the thing that happened that caused the trauma is not usually the worst of everything that happened. It's the tipping point in your brain. And so what we're up to 4, 5, that point of trauma is that we end up in this unsafe state. And that is a really difficult place to be in. And it causes a ripple effect on all sorts of aspects of your life. So last piece. So what do we do about it? And this is the really tricky thing, right? So there's lots of things out there for how we can work with trauma. You'll have come across probably EMI, EMDR kind of stuff, which is the eye movement thing. What that does is the trauma is coded in your brain. Like I say, it's absolutely physically coded in your brain. So you can use the movement of your eyes because your brain, you store things in different parts of your brain. You've probably seen those diagrams with all the different parts of your brain. Well, physically, that is true. So as you move your eyes, you're accessing different parts of your brain. So you can actually use good parts to overwrite bad parts, and that can help with the trauma. That is often used for post-traumatic stress disorder kind of trauma, and it's used very effectively for that. There's another technique, which is the one I tend to use, which is a technique called rewind or fast phobia. Because the problem here is not what happened, it's the way your brain's encoded it. So if you can change the way your brain has encoded a traumatic memory, you can get rid of the shutters. And it sounds ridiculously simple for something so significant. But it uses this fact that your brain doesn't have track changes and doesn't have revision history. So something as simple as, now the hardest thing about this is you kind of have to look at that thing that you don't usually look at, which is the traumatic space in your brain. But something as simple as zooming in or zooming out on the memory fundamentally changes the way your brain has programmed it. The way your brain works, it's got everything linked. And if you change one of the links, it's kind of going, oh, well, that wasn't that way, so that wasn't that way, so that wasn't that way, and the whole structure collapses. So we don't care about changing what happens. We can't. When traumatic stuff happens, it just sucks. You can't change it. But you can change the meaning in it. And you can lose the meaning quite simply by using that neuroplasticity and changing your brain. So you can zoom in or zoom out of a memory. You can make it black and white. You can make it blurry. You can do different things to the sounds. You can play a ridiculous music track in the background, or even a really fun music track in the background. All of these things mess around with the way the memory is stored. And by messing around with the way the memory is stored, it can lose the meaning. And losing the meaning means the shutters can go up, you can come out the hole, whatever it is. So there are things you can do. I mean, it's obviously something that you wouldn't generally do on your own. But if you've got something that's getting in the way of your life, then you can use that kind of technique of zooming in, zooming out sort of stuff. If you're finding that you've got kind of a pokey memory that keeps popping up and it keeps hurting you, you can use this zoom in and zoom out. But the main reason I'm talking to you about trauma is not so much for you as much as when you talk to other people. You just need to talk to other people, and actually now you've made me paranoid. When you talk to other people and when you see things and when you use phrases like that must have been really traumatic for you, or when somebody says it to you, just be aware what that actually means and how you have no idea what it means to somebody else. And actually you can help with somebody else. If you have somebody that you know has experienced something traumatic, is living through it, and when they're talking to you is really in the pits of hell, as people can often be when these things are getting in the way, you can just say things like, wonder what would happen if it was black and white, or you zoomed in, zoomed out. And you see, the thing is, like not being able to think of a pink elephant, if you say zoom in, so you pick a memory, and if I say to you zoom in on that memory, you're going to zoom in on it. You can't help it. You know, and you don't realize the scale of impact that it can have on the way the memory is stored. So actually you can just say things casually and it will make a difference. But people won't know it's made a difference. They'll just assume it's still the same. But you'll sometimes notice a difference in them before they notice it themselves. So I guess the point of this overall was to just firstly help you understand how trauma maybe is not as simple as we often think it is, and is sometimes labeled incorrectly in that sense. How trauma is very personal and very unique, and is about meaning, not necessarily what happens. And that meaning can be created by a tipping point, a point that is so emotionally difficult to deal with that you can't deal with it. And that trauma then creates a massive knock-on effect to all sorts of aspects of your life, well beyond the scope of what you'd expect. When I clear trauma in my clients, the things they experience in life going from being angry to being happy all the time, being okay with going into social situations and they thought that was just them, that they were shy. You know, we have these labels and these stories about who we are and why we're that way. And when you clear trauma, you suddenly realize that wasn't true at all. Be a bit scary, to be honest with you, to not know yourself. If everything you've known about yourself changes, that can be pretty scary. So it's not something to mess around with lightly, but it is something that can be changed. And so that's the final thing I want to leave you with, is that, you know, we have a perception that we just have to cope with these things. But actually, no matter what, you can always change it, because it's just a coding problem in the brain. Everything is possible to overcome if you can find a way to do it. And a lot of the time you need help. It's really hard to change this stuff yourself. But small differences can really work. And be really aware of your language. The language we use around people can really make a massive difference. And you'll find lots of resources online. If you look up the Resilience Movie, it's theresiliencemovie.com, or any adverse childhood experience stuff, the ACEs stuff. You might even have a group local to you if you're interested in this. It's fascinating stuff. And there's lots of research now about the impact that it has on our minds and bodies. And there's lots of people working to how we can use language. The Scottish police use trauma teddies. So when they go into a situation with a kid, they take a trauma teddy to help the kid through it. You know, so there's lots of stuff really happening now around this. So you can find out loads more information than I could possibly give you. But hopefully this has given you a little bit of an overview about how we can look and think about trauma. I'm going to pause for a second now, just in case anybody wants to ask any questions. Usually you don't. Usually we just kind of leave them till afterwards. This video will be available as a recording afterwards, and you will be able to comment on it and ask questions and things like that. What I'll try and do, let me do it now. I will put in the link to the Resilience Movie. This is really fascinating for anybody watching on live video, because they get to watch me sit here and type. I think it's called resiliencemovie.com. Let me just put that in the link, so you should see that, and you should be able to follow that and go and have a look at that. If anybody's interested in that, it's fascinating stuff. So whether you use it for yourself or you use it for the people around you, just be aware that trauma can be changed. And I'll leave you on that note. And yes, I know the conference in Glasgow, I don't have the pennies for that kind of thing. But I'll work on it in other areas. I do find the ACEs stuff fascinating. So thank you for listening. Thank you for attending. Hopefully we'll engage more on this in the future. And for now, I shall end that video. So thanks a lot for coming along, and I will catch up with you all later. Bye.